just as Mipa Rinpoche said, everything is samsara, in fact, are all like dreams and illusions. One should not be arrogant when rich and powerful, nor fearful and weak when poor and unsuccessful. So really, all the worldly enjoyments are nothing special. You may have fame, you may have wealth, but who knows what you have or not have tomorrow. And even if you have some money, but compared to the most rich man in this world, you still have much, much less. So you should consider it in such a way. There's a story in the sutra. It says that there was once an old bhikshu in the sangha of the Buddha. He sweeps his floor every day, and everybody looks down on him. And he himself is really slow as well. He couldn't memorize the stanzas, doesn't matter how many times he tries. And then one day, a king was going to make offering to the Sangha. And because the Buddha knows at the time, it is the time to it's time to help the old bhikshu to gain realization, inner realization. Therefore, he transformed himself into or appeared or manifested as a student. At the time, the old bhikshu felt really upset and depressed, feeling that everyone looks down on him and he doesn't want to live anymore. He was just about to hang himself on the tree. And then that student who was the Buddha suddenly showed up and started to scold him, saying that what's the use of killing yourself? You should really confess your previous bad karma. You should know that at the time of the Kashyapa Buddha, there was a bhikshu who was very knowledgeable, but he was very arrogant, and that was you. And then the old bhikshu started to confess and then received a certain fruition. Later on, he went to the palace to also receive the offering from the king, as well as along with the 500 bhikshus. And then the Buddha told him to sit on the throne and give teachings to the rest of the people. At first, the people didn't understand why the old bhikshu was sitting on the throne, but because the king was there, so all the other bhikshus didn't want to say anything. And once the bhikshu started giving the teaching of Dharma, because he already attained a certain level of fruition, his teaching was very powerful, and many people who were listening to his teaching attained realization as well. So even though maybe even now you have some merit and wealth, don't get too happy. Just as the weather, maybe today the weather is really good, but all of a sudden it could become a thunderstorm very soon. So don't feel that, oh, the weather is so great, I'm so happy, or the weather's terrible, what do I do? Don't do that, because the weather could get clear again very soon. Just as that, we shouldn't grasp onto happiness nor suffering. And then, according to Padampa Sanji, he pointed out if we human beings can cope with lots of suffering but very little happiness. I think this teaching is excellent. I think even if we encounter some suffering and obstacles, if we try very hard, we can deal with that. We can cope with it. Some of our fellow practitioners, in fact, are of this type of personality. Whenever they encounter problems, they are more calm and they are more resilient. But so it is quite important to see the person's true character through obstacles. There are people who would all of a sudden get more wisdom and more strength when there's obstacles. And on the contrary, there are people who would encounter suffering and not able to have strength. But there are people who could deal with suffering really well, but not very well when it comes to happiness. They could get lost very quickly if they are happy. Just as some of the Dharma masters, at the beginning when they are practicing in hardship, they are very diligent, but once they gain fame and wealth and other people's offerings, they becomes rather arrogant. Just as some teachers I know, at first they really invested time and effort in practicing the Dharma during hardship. But later on, when he has students and disciples, he would then stand in the center and a group of students on the left, on the right, and he himself looked like a great toku in the middle, and he would say, "Oh, I'm here. I'm doing really well in my Dharma practice, in my Dharma propagation and benefiting all sentient beings, and the government is also supporting me. This is my great disciple, and that one is my great that one also provides me great support, and now I'm going to have dialogues with scientists." I'm not even sure if that person could understand science with this kind of attitude. Anyhow, there are people who can cope with suffering, but not so much of coping with happiness. During Cultural Revolution, there were great masters who can cope with suffering quite a bit, but after the opening up, then they would receive lots of offerings, and some of them eventually got derobed, which is not so successful at the end. There are examples like that too. So there are people who could not cope with suffering. There are the ones who could cope with suffering but not with happiness. In fact, it's difficult not to be carried away by happiness. So that's why we need to open our eyes in whatever ways we can to the fact that happiness and things that cause happiness are all actually impermanent and are by nature suffering. So try as best as you can to arouse a deep sense of disillusionment and to stop your mind indulging in its unusual apathy and negligence. This is quite important. Just as it is stated in Precious Garland of Madhyamika, it says that the so-called happiness is in fact suffering in disguise. It is just an illusion created by our dualistic thoughts. Same as 400 verses, it says that in fact happiness is suffering because happiness changes. At the time of losing such happiness, people would feel pain. So when we're happy, I think in fact such happiness doesn't have intrinsic meaning because it is just like a dream, like an illusion. There's nothing to obtain in the absolute truth. The Buddha said all the happiness from celestial realm and human realm should be seen as insubstantial, and one should see the world just as a foolish play. It has the form but nothing intrinsically existent. So we should know that all the happiness, just like a fool's game, it is a game, but through your observation with your wisdom, you should understand that in fact it they're all empty, insubstantial, and doesn't even have a name to it. And if we were to contemplate in such a way, then we should understand that in fact all the happiness in this world has nothing reliable about it at all. And therefore, after contemplating upon it, even when you are really happy, you would feel that happiness is nothing to be grasped onto. You should be able to understand that and to see the true face of happiness. And in such a way, once you see the defiled happiness, in fact, is nothing to grasp onto. It's not worth grasping at all. According to the Uddanavarga Sutra, it says that just like fish living in a swamp of water that decreases daily, our life also decreases daily and decrease day by day. In such a way, where is the happiness? What are we being so happy about? So our lives decrease day by day. For example, if my life has 30,000 days, but every single day that I spend in this life, that means I have one less day to live. There's really nothing to be so arrogant about. Just like a cow that is locked up in a slaughterhouse, though temporarily he may feel really happy, but for people with wisdom, upon their perception, upon their investigation, they would know that you may have happiness now, but it won't last long. So the fish living in a little spring or swamp, once the water stops, then the so-called happiness, seeing the fish swimming here and there, that kind of happiness, in fact, there's nothing to be happy about, really. Understanding the truth of the defiled happiness in this world, you won't be so arrogant about happiness anymore. You won't grasp onto the so-called happiness anymore. You won't be so distracted, and you won't be squandering your days without practicing anymore. You won't squander your time doing meaningless things either. So all the happiness and all the happiness and material wealth of this world is trifling and insignificant and brings with it all kinds of problems and difficulties. Still, in certain sense, it does have its good side. Well, the worldly happiness does look good. It's very attractive. It may look even meaningful temporarily. Whatever happiness in this world, the happiness from wealth or from relationship and so on, in fact, all of those happiness are connected to suffering, to obstacles. And because of that, I think there are people who want to get rid of happiness altogether. In fact, that is not necessary. Happiness also has its merit. Buddhism talks about not falling into the two extremes. People would say that, but someone wrote a book on life is suffering. You must be wrong. In fact, the happiness also exists. That is the more of a Madhyamika way of looking at it. Why are you so happy? So why is that then? The Buddha also said that someone whose freedom is impaired by suffering will have great difficulty attaining enlightenment. For example, if you don't have freedom, physical freedom, if you are imprisoned, or freedom from illness, or if you don't have freedom of having certain provisions in this life, then if you're in all those kinds of situations, I think practicing in this lifetime would be very, very difficult. Therefore, if you don't even have all the basics of life, the basics of freedom, it will be very difficult to practice. There are people out of different causes, such as family, work, and their own obstacles. They then don't have opportunities to practice the Dharma. There are people who have everything but lacks faith and devotion, then they can't practice either. So then the Buddha said that for this kind of people, it's very difficult for them to practice. So compared to that, for someone who is happy, it is easier to attain enlightenment, to practice the Bodhi. People who are happy, maybe they have sufficient food and clothing and all kinds of circumstances. Maybe they even look good, they have good relationship, everything. And then it would be easier for them to attain enlightenment. There are practitioners, however, have nothing, really have no house, no food, no corresponding situation or circumstances to practice the Dharma. Then it doesn't matter how much they try in this life, they would feel that I really couldn't spare the time or get the favorable conditions to study the Dharma. I am suffering so much. Maybe it is because of my previous karma. I'm so poor. I really have no way of studying the Dharma. So for those kind of people, I think it will be very difficult to attain enlightenment. On the other hand, if you have your own space, if you have some freedom, and for those kind of people who have happiness in their mind, then there are opportunities for such ones to practice on the path of Bodhi.